Before we begin, Galactic Horrors is now on Patreon. Get daily stories in one place, with no ads and no interruptions. Link is in the description or search Galactic Horrors on Patreon. Now, let's begin the transmission. The anchor housing wouldn't seat. I worked the base plate against the surface while the transit ring behind me shed alignment heat. The ring was our door home. A 2-meter circle of shaped alloy that Gate Command had calibrated to this destination's coordinates before we stepped through. Standard procedure. 4 soldiers. 1 hauler, 1 phase anchor, 1 parallel Earth to certify. What should have been bare ground on the far side looked like weathered concrete. Pale, smooth, continuous to every horizon. The mounting bolts sank half an inch, then stopped. I leaned harder. The material yielded, then firmed around the bolt heads as if deciding how much intrusion to allow. "Hewitt, give me a timeline." Captain John Rhodes stood 3 meters from the ring perimeter, surveying the terrain through his rifle optic. 2 minutes on the base plate, maybe 3 on the calibration if the ground cooperates. It wasn't cooperating. My left arm was already losing its spatial sense. That familiar deadness creeping from shoulder to fingertips, the phase damage waking up near an active transit system. I could feel the ring behind me, the way you feel a high-voltage line through a wall. Position became unreliable. The bolts were where I put them, but my hand kept insisting they'd shifted. Corporal Danny Marr had his mapping drone up within 40 seconds of stepping through. The small rotorcraft climbed in a wide arc, feeding terrain data to his handheld display. "Surface is uniform for at least 8 clicks in every direction," he reported. "Sealed up tight. No exposed soil, no breaks." Corpsman Jesse Pell ran atmospheric checks at the ring's edge. "Air's breathable, temps reasonable." He crouched, pressing a sensor probe against the pale ground. "But the surface composition, this isn't geological. Silicate carbon composite. Someone manufactured this." Rhodes lowered the optic. "Manufactured what, specifically?" "All of it." Pell swept his arm toward the horizon. "This surface. The whole thing." That was when we stopped treating it as a standard gate site. Gate Command had briefed us for an uninhabited parallel Earth, matching geography and starfield, no indigenous population. It was our detachment's 4th operation, my 2nd as breach engineer since they pulled me from frontline authority. The transit ring was supposed to anchor into open terrain. We'd verify habitability, install a permanent return alignment, and file the coordinates for follow-on teams. Routine work, the kind that looks good on a reinstatement review. The surface under my tools was not routine. I seated the base plate by driving the anchors at an angle, punching past the initial resistance into whatever substrate lay beneath the top layer. The phase anchor powered up cleanly, its carrier signal locked onto our homeside coordinates. A narrow electromagnetic thread stretching back through the ring to Gate Command, to our barracks, to the world where my reassignment paperwork sat on a review board desk. 3 years earlier, I'd severed an unstable transit ring during a combat withdrawal while 6 soldiers were still on the far side. The ring had begun an alignment collapse. The spatial distortion was propagating toward a populated colony staging area. I cut the connection. The anomaly died. The 6 men died with it, or remained behind in whatever was left of the destination. Gate Command stripped my rank authority, but kept me available for the jobs nobody else volunteered for. Irreversible closures, hard shutdowns, the work where someone has to decide who stays behind so the door can close. This mission was supposed to close that file. 4 clean gatehead installations, Rhodes's recommendation, a path back to frontline assignment. That was the deal Command offered after the inquiry. My arm was the souvenir. Phase exposure had damaged the nerve paths from shoulder to wrist. Near active gate systems, my proprioception degraded. I couldn't trust where my hand was in space without looking at it. Anchor work became difficult at exactly the moments it mattered most. The condition also made me useful. I could feel alignment instability through the damage before instruments registered the change. My ruined nerves were better sensors than anything Gate Command manufactured. "Hewitt! The ring!" Rhodes's voice came again. I turned. The transit ring's lower frame had sunk 2 inches into the surface. While I'd been working on the anchor, the pale material had risen around the ring's base, sealing against the metal. The ground was climbing. My arm confirmed it before I checked the instruments. The carrier signal was changing. Home side coordinates dimming inside a wash of local interference, as if something enormous were writing over our return address. I pulled the diagnostic panel from the anchor housing. The numbers were bad. Our gate frequency was being reclassified. The planetary surface was treating our transit ring as part of its own infrastructure, filing our connection into a registry that listed our version of Earth as extinct. "The surface is incorporating the ring," I told Rhodes. "Active integration. It's overwriting our home coordinates." "Stop it. I can slow it. The anchor's carrier signal can hold our frequency, but it doesn't carry the authority code to override whatever network is doing this. We need a compatible root cylinder, a physical key that can force the system to recognize our connection as current." Rhodes already had the pre-mission intelligence file open. Cape Canaveral, or this world's version of it, had a registration pylon that should house compatible routing hardware. 40-some miles across sealed terrain, Danny's drone feed showed the route. Sealed highways buried under the pale surface. Suburban districts wrapped in continuous material. The shapes of houses, cars, and light poles were visible as raised ridges beneath the crust, a city pressed under a wax sheet. Everything remained intact, an entire civilization held beneath a continuous pale skin. This Earth had been covered, preserved whole. "We move now," Rhodes said. "Hewitt, keep the anchor active. Ma, continuous terrain mapping. Pell, combat load plus medical. We're burning daylight on a clock we can't see." We loaded the phase anchor onto the tracked hauler, a compact vehicle designed for terrain that fought back. The 100-pound anchor cradle, power cells, spare parts, ammunition. The hauler's electric treads rolled across the sealed ground with constant surface contact, every meter of travel pressing current into the compound. That was the problem I hadn't solved yet. The anchor broadcast our home frequency. The hauler broadcast our position. We were crossing an enemy's nerve endings while dragging the noisiest piece of equipment on the planet. The first seam opened 400 meters from our gate site. The burial surface split along a line roughly 2 meters across. The material inside was darker, wet-looking, layered in curved plates. Something beneath those plates moved with the slow power of a hydraulic press. The thing that climbed out assembled itself as it rose. 6 limbs unfolding from a torso cased in overlapping mineral segments. The forward pair opening into wide, angular frames lined with thin metallic filaments. Dense, low-built, wrapped in the same silicate carbon compound as the ground it came from. The surface given a shape, given a job. It came at the hauler. Danny fired first. 3 rounds hit the forward plating. The mineral surface chipped, but the creature didn't slow. Rear limbs drove it forward in a grinding lunge, the restraint frames on its front pair spreading wide. Rhodes put a burst into the joint between its upper body segments. The thing stumbled. I swung the hauler's mounted tool arm, a cutting torch assembly meant for structural breach work, into its flank. The torch punched through the gap between plates into the dense muscle underneath. The creature seized the tool arm. Its forward restraint frame clamped shut around the metal. The filaments lining the frame, thin, sharp, each one moving with independent purpose, began reaching for my forearm, probing gaps in my sleeve, threading between fabric and equipment straps. Each filament sought skin, a path to my nervous system. Pell hit it from behind with a breaching charge taped to a chunk of loose material. The detonation cracked its rear thorax open. The creature released the tool arm, turned toward Pell. Rhodes put 2 more rounds through the exposed muscle. It collapsed in a grinding heap, plates sliding apart as the body beneath them lost cohesion. Pell knelt beside the remains. He pulled one of the filaments from the wreckage, 1/2 meter of it still twitching at the cut end. The tip was shaped to penetrate soft tissue. A neural bridge. One end would have connected to the creature's internal systems. The other was built for a human spinal column. "It was trying to plug us in," Pell said. "It was built to take us alive." I looked at the seam where the thing had emerged. Already closing. The burial compound flowing back together, smoothing over the gap. The creature had been manufactured from the ground, assembled from the same material that sealed everything, built in response to our hauler's electrical footprint, deployed to capture us and connect us to whatever the sealed surface was running. Rhodes stared south, toward Cape Canaveral, toward 40 miles of the same surface, producing the same things. "Move out," he said. The highway ran south beneath the burial layer like a spine beneath skin. Danny's drone tracked the road's course by following the raised ridge where the median barrier sat under the compound. Cars were frozen in their last positions, bumper to bumper in places, a sealed evacuation corridor that never reached wherever it was going. Danny flew the drone in short passes ahead of us, marking points where the surface showed seam activity, slightly darker lines where creatures could manufacture. The pattern was becoming readable. Seams clustered around junctions, anywhere the buried infrastructure created electrical pathways the compound had incorporated. We crossed a residential district in the first hour. The compound wrapped every structure with exact fidelity. Rooflines preserved, window frames traceable beneath the crust. Through gaps cut by someone before us, we could see furnished rooms. A kitchen table with plates still set. A child's bed visible through an upper window. People had lived here. Someone had cut into the compound afterward, years or decades later, to see what was inside. The evidence of previous expeditions appeared around the 6th mile. An abandoned hauler sat half-absorbed into the surface near an overpass. Different model from ours. Heavier chassis, different tread pattern, markings in a script none of us could recognize. The burial compound had climbed its frame, sealed the cab shut. Whoever had driven it here came from a different parallel Earth, used different equipment, wrote in a different alphabet. They had tried to cross this same terrain toward the same destination. The hauler's anchor cradle was empty. Either they'd taken their phase anchor with them, or something had removed it. Past the overpass, more rubble. A cache of supply containers stacked against a sealed wall, contents rotted to powder behind intact lids. A helmet nearby, its faceplate cracked outward from inside, as if the wearer had struck it against the ground while being pinned. Other people had come through other gates. Other teams had tried to cross this surface. The equipment they'd left behind was part of the landscape now. The creatures came in groups after the 10th mile. The first group emerged from seams ahead of us, flanking right. They advanced with deliberate cover, using the raised ridge of a buried overpass wall and the sealed bulk of a delivery truck. Their movement had a learned quality, angles chosen by something that understood sight lines. The lead creature showed itself long enough to draw Rhodes's rifle. Danny's drone swung wide over the delivery truck. "Second one behind the median," Danny said. "Pell right. Hewitt. The hauler leaves a blind wedge on your left." A restraint frame opened inside that wedge. Pell dropped under it. Rhodes fired into the joint Danny marked while the lead creature used our turn to lunge from cover. I caught it with the tool arm and held the torch against the seam under its forward plates. Danny dipped the drone at the third creature, drawing its frame upward long enough for Pell to shoot the muscle behind it. The creature dragged itself backward into a seam. Afterward, Danny tapped the unarmored coupling beside the left tread. Anything that reaches this can cut anchor power from the blind wedge. We reinforce it at the first stop. We didn't. The carrier signal had degraded during the fight, and Rhodes kept us moving. They're using cover, he said. Previous captures, I said. Someone else's training. Then we move faster. We couldn't move faster. The hauler's top speed was dictated by the anchor's stabilization requirements, the uneven substrate beneath the burial layer, the fact that every additional watt of power went directly into the ground. We were loud, slow, visible. The only advantage we had was the institutional memory of every failure that preceded us. Danny needed high ground for the drone relay. A sealed office tower near the highway offered roof access through a gap cut in the burial layer, someone's old maintenance route. Danny scaled the gap with the relay unit while we held position below. From the roof, his drone's range tripled. He could see the Cape Canaveral complex on the horizon. Registration pylons rose above the sealed terrain like monuments, their surfaces distinct from the burial compound, darker, with visible internal architecture. Danny's relay signal must have drawn them. 4 creatures scaled the building's exterior, gripping sealed features and approaching from multiple elevations. They reached the roof access from angles that avoided Danny's camera coverage. The drone captured it in fragments, a limb appearing over a ledge, a body hauling itself through an unsealed window gap, restraint frames opening in the peripheral feed. Danny called contact. We were 40 meters below at street level. Rhodes started up the gap. I followed, watching my left hand close around each exposed window frame. Danny's feed jumped between the roof and the stairwell, 2 binders inside, 2 above, Danny backing toward the access gap with the relay harness across his chest. "They're closing the stair," he said. We were 3 floors up when the drone spun sideways. The image caught Danny firing downward and a restraint frame closing around his relay harness. The creature pulled him off his feet. Then the drone fell, its damaged rotor cutting out, and the relay unit struck the sealed surface beside the hauler. Rhodes climbed 1 more level. Danny's weapon fired 6 rounds above us. A body hit a railing. Something dragged across the floor. Then came the rapid ticking of filaments finding purchase on equipment straps, working through fabric, reaching for skin. Pell's voice cut through the alarm from below. Compound had risen over the hauler's left tread and reached the anchor cradle. The diagnostic alarm went continuous. Carrier loss. 68 seconds. Danny's unreinforced coupling was already half buried. Rhodes had 1 knee inside the office floor. He could keep climbing. Pell could try to free the anchor alone. Rhodes looked up the stairwell. He looked down at the anchor. Then he looked at me. I knew this shape, this exact decision. The building had 4 creatures in it, at minimum. Danny was above them, separated. The anchor was below us, keeping our home coordinates from vanishing. If we went up, we risked the anchor. We risked everything. I'd been here before. I'd made this choice before. At a different gate, on a different world, with 6 men instead of 1. "We keep moving," I said. Rhodes held the window frame until the metal bent under his glove. Then he backed into the gap and descended. Pell was cutting compound away from the power coupling when we reached the ground. He didn't ask where Danny was. He knew from how we came down. The consequence arrived within the hour. 3 creatures emerged from seams in a parking structure. Their movement had changed. 1 covered, while the other 2 advanced in a staggered formation. The group circled toward the hauler's left side, where Danny's coverage maps had identified a gap in our firing arcs. They were using the weakness Danny had mapped, guided by his sense of where observation couldn't reach. They'd taken it from him. Rhodes killed the lead creature. I burned the second with the cutting torch at close range, the tool arm sinking through its plate gap while it tried to pin me against the hauler chassis. Pell shot the third through an exposed joint in its rear thorax, a vulnerability only visible from an angle Danny's drone had catalogued. We survived because we recognized Danny's professional thinking inside their movements. Every formation and angle carried his fingerprint. His instinct for terrain, his understanding of where to position for maximum coverage. Every creature manufactured after Danny's capture would fight a little more like a reconnaissance soldier trained by Gate Command. Rhodes went quiet. Pell kept examining the bodies, searching for something recognizable in how they'd positioned themselves. I checked the anchor's carrier signal. Still holding, still degrading. The terrain changed near the coast. The burial compound thinned over marshy ground. Patches of exposed soil appeared, dark wet earth visible between slabs of pale material. The compound seemed to struggle with saturated substrate. In places, it had cracked under its own weight, where the ground underneath was waterlogged. Someone had widened those cracks. Cut marks in the compound's edge. Clean, tool-made lines. Rubber sheeting nailed over exposed soil. Tunnel entrances dropping below the surface, their openings reinforced with salvaged metal, their interiors lined with insulating material. We were examining the nearest tunnel entrance when the people appeared around us, 12 of them. Patched pressure suits insulated with rubber panels, weapons I didn't recognize, low profile, no visible power source, built to suppress electrical output. One of them told us later they'd been watching since the highway. Danny climbing the building, then us walking away from him. They brought us underground at weapon point, into a world the burial compound had never sealed. The tunnels beneath the Cape Canaveral launch complex had been stripped to bare concrete in some sections, raw soil in others. Every surface that once held conduit or wiring had been gutted. Rubber sheeting covered the floors. Oil lamps burned in wall niches. Every system ran without electricity, preventing current from reaching the ground above. The settlement held maybe 200 people, families, children in worn clothes. An older man with burns on his forearms bent over a hand-operated water pump. A workshop where salvaged metal was shaped with hammers, files, chisels, everything manual, everything quiet. This place was a record of what the burial layer could detect, written in absence. Whatever these people had eliminated from their lives defined the enemy's sensor range. They disarmed us, separated us from the hauler, brought us to a reinforced chamber deep inside the tunnel network. The man who'd organized the capture sat across from us on a concrete ledge. Nate Kest was maybe 30, lean, hard-worn, someone who'd grown up navigating spaces where a wrong step meant detection. His pressure suit was patched so many times the original material was barely visible. Insulating rubber lined every seam. Around his ribcage, a conductive brace connected to a graft in his right palm, a disc of dark material, about 2 centimeters across. His hand moved while he talked. Small corrections in grip, shifts in finger position that didn't match what his arm was doing. His thumb drifted sideways against the concrete, pressing flat in a pattern that belonged to someone else. The graft was leaking motor patterns from the planetary network, feeding him movements borrowed from incorporated humans, replacing his trained reflexes with foreign ones. Every time a gate opens, Nate said, the pylons activate, the sealed territory expands. The compound generates new material from whatever substrate is underneath, soil, rock, rubble, fills the gaps, buries anything the previous event missed. His voice was instructional, the way someone talks about a danger they've taught long enough to simplify. Your gate is the 4th I've seen in my lifetime. The previous one took 300 meters of safe route. 40 people lost shelter. 16 were taken. Taken by what? Pell asked. We call them binders, the things you've been fighting. Nate held up his grafted palm. This came from one. They capture people alive. They pin you against the compound, drive nerve connectors through your equipment, link your spinal activity to the network. Every person sealed inside the burial layer is still biologically active, still processing. Processing what? Rhodes asked. Nate pointed upward. You saw the pylons from the surface. They go down through the burial layer into everything underneath. Old subway tunnels, hospital basements, utility corridors. They use the people sealed in the compound as navigators. He watched our faces while he spoke, measuring comprehension. The gate network runs on prediction. Where things are, where they'll be, how connections between parallel worlds shift over time. Billions of preserved human minds performing that calculation at reduced biological rates. That's what your transit system is built on. Every gate connection in human history has been riding on this. The idea settled into each of us differently. Pell leaned forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the concrete. Rhodes's expression gave nothing away, which meant he was weighing the strategic costs behind it. I looked at the rubber-lined walls, the oil lamps, the stripped concrete. Everything these people had built was designed around that knowledge. How long? I asked. Our people have lived down here for generations. We don't know when the sealing happened. Our grandparents' were already living here. Nate's grafted hand made that wrong movement again, his fingers spreading against the concrete, pressing in a rhythm that belonged to someone else. People escaped during the original event. Found spaces the compound couldn't reach. Water-saturated soil, rubber-insulated rooms, sections stripped to raw earth. We've been cutting safe routes through the sealed cities ever since. He paused. Every gate expedition that's come through has made it harder. Rhodes cut in. The Canaveral pylon. You know how to reach it. I know every access route within 50 kilometers of this settlement. I know which surfaces are safe, which seams produce binders, which passages the compound hasn't been able to reseal. Nate's grafted hand twitched once against the concrete. I also know what's inside. Root cylinders, Rhodes said, among other things. Nate looked at Rhodes with an expression I recognized. Someone deciding how much to trust a man whose objectives might not survive contact with what was actually down there. My brother is inside that pylon. He was taken during the last recall event, 14 years old. The system incorporated him into the local control sector as a switching node for the network's navigation traffic. He's being used as a routing junction. The chamber went quiet. I'll take you to the pylon, Nate said. I need your phase anchor to access the core. Your engineer knows how to interface with gate systems. I know the route. Those are the terms. Rhodes accepted before I could speak. The root cylinder was his objective. Everything else, Danny, the settlement, the preserved billions above us, occupied a different column in his mission ledger. I understood his thinking because it was the same thinking that had shaped my career. Smaller group, larger mission. Gate Command built that trade-off into every operational briefing. The settlement's leaders didn't agree. A woman named Grace Archer. She ran the water systems, which apparently gave her authority over who entered the tunnels, argued that bringing a powered phase anchor into pylon territory was the most dangerous act any of them could authorize. Every previous gate team had awakened dormant systems, expanded the burial territory, caused shelters to vanish under fresh compound. Every team says they're here to help, she told Rhodes. Every team promises they'll be careful. Then the pylons activate, the compound spreads. Our people get buried while yours try to save themselves. She pointed at the ceiling. There are uniforms up there from 6 different versions of Earth. 6 expeditions. None of them went home. All of them made things worse. The west drainage route runs under the pylon field, Grace said to Nate. If that anchor wakes the lower seams, we lose the cistern and 38 beds before we can move them. You don't get to spend those people on your brother. Nate looked toward the tunnel mouth where 3 route runners were already waiting with packs. Empty the beds. Move the water stores east before we leave. If the route seals, my crews reopen it. Your crews answer to the settlement. Then they can remove me when I come back. Grace turned to Rhodes. Run the anchor at half output until you're past the drainage. Half output loses our return lock, Rhodes said. That refusal settled the bargain more completely than an agreement would have. Nate overruled Grace. He had authority among the route runners, the scouts who maintained safe passages through the sealed cities, the kind of authority that came from being one of the few people willing to enter active pylon territory. The settlement's leaders deferred, but they didn't agree. I could see the cost of his decision in the people carrying water tins and rolled bedding toward the eastern tunnels while we prepared to leave. Pell pulled me aside while Rhodes discussed route details with Nate. Those preserved people above us, the ones sealed in the compound. What about them? Some of them are still medically viable. If we could isolate their neural connections from the burial layer, disconnect them carefully, some of those people could be brought back. I looked at him. Pell was the best field medic I'd worked with. He was also the kind of person who counted individual lives when the mission only required counting ammunition. "We don't have supplies for that," I said. "We have supplies. We just have other plans for them." He left it there. The preserved people above us were going to become a question we'd have to answer, one body at a time. We left the settlement at what the unregistered called quarter dark, a time designation based on the oil lamp schedule rather than any clock. The burial compound blocked most natural light. Day was brighter than night, but both were dim enough to navigate by headlamp. Nate guided us through a stripped maintenance corridor beneath the launch complex perimeter. Rhodes walked behind him, Pell beside the hauler. I kept my hand on the anchor housing, monitoring the carrier signal through my damaged arm. The home coordinates were still there, weaker, buried under layers of local interference but present. A thread back to a world where people walked on open ground. 3 access levels separated us from the pylon core. The first crossed the sealed surface complex through the old launch gantries. The second descended into a submerged coolant transfer station beneath the coastal marsh. The third entered the maintenance district the unregistered had carved inside the pylon's outer wall. Nate's palm graft, lit against an access panel, held for 2 seconds, went dark. A sealed door ground open on corroded tracks. Beyond it, the launch gantries rose into grey light, wrapped in burial compound, the shapes of rockets still visible beneath the pale surface like rebar cast inside concrete. Nate moved through without looking back. His brother was in there. My way home was out here, degrading with every hour. Both of us were willing to pay whatever the next room cost. The launch gantries rose around us like bones inside a cast. The compound was 2 meters thick in places here, wrapped tight around the gantry structures. Service platforms, fuel conduits, cable trays, all of it preserved as ridges beneath the pale surface. The vehicle assembly building loomed to our west, reduced to a massive smooth mound rising 50 meters above the sealed terrain. Rockets stood fixed inside their cradles, nose cones pressing against the compound's inner surface like fingers pushing through a glove. Nate guided us through routes his people had cut over decades. Narrow channels carved through the compound. Rubber-insulated walkways bridging sections where the burial layer remained active. Gaps wide enough for a person but too narrow for the hauler. That was the first problem. We had to power the cutting torch to widen passages, burning through compound while the anchor broadcast our position. Each cut sealed behind us within minutes. The pylon's network sensed the damage, extended new material to repair the gaps. We were boring through tissue that healed faster than we could move. The binders that found us in the launch corridor were different from anything on the highway. They waited. 2 held position behind a sealed fuel tank, while a third circled through a service passage Nate hadn't mapped. The flanking creature came in low, targeting the hauler's power coupling, the specific junction where the anchor drew current from the vehicle's cells. Danny had identified that junction after the first highway attack and suggested we reinforce it. We had left it exposed. The creature reached the coupling before Rhodes could fire. Its restraint frame clamped around the cable housing. The filaments inside the frame bypassed the nearest skin and spread across the connector pins and diagnostic contacts, bridging them in moving combinations. The hauler's display lit with authentication requests. Local route registration. Operator identity. A sequence trying to make the anchor answer through the vehicle that powered it. I drove the cutting torch between its forward plates. The muscle beneath the mineral armor held for a full second before the torch punched through. The creature's rear limbs locked against the hauler chassis. Even dying, it held position and kept the coupling closed. Pell pried the restraint frame open with a breaching bar, while I kept the torch buried in its torso. Only when he broke the frame away did the remaining filaments turn from the hardware and reach for the gap between my glove and sleeve, each one threading independently towards skin. The last filament went still when the creature's internal systems finally failed. The other two pulled back into the compound walls. The seams closed over them. They'd withdrawn, a behavior we hadn't seen before. "They're learning to prioritize targets," I said. "They went for the power coupling." "Danny's assessment," Rhodes said. Nate brought us through a breach in the compound wall into a staging area beneath the old launch control center, a space the unregistered had widened over years. Old supply caches lined the walls. A hand-drawn map of the pylon's outer structure covered one surface, annotated in generations of handwriting. Pell found the preserved medical station in an adjoining corridor. Someone had cut into the compound wall years ago, exposing a military aid station from the original ceiling. The room was intact beneath the burial layer. Field cots, IV stands, equipment cabinets. The soldiers were still inside, 8 of them, wearing American uniforms with unit patches that matched nothing in our database. This world's military, frozen in the positions they occupied when the compound arrived. 2 on cots. The rest caught standing or crouching, arms raised, reaching for equipment they never touched. Pell's hands were on the nearest soldier before Rhodes could object. The man was sealed into the compound from the waist down. His upper body protruded into the exposed room, arms raised in front of his face, a defensive posture held for decades. Pell ran the medical scanner across his torso. Cardiac function, neural activity, metabolic processing at roughly 1% of baseline. The readout changed below the navel. Blood flow through the legs did not follow a human vascular pattern. The compound was moving it for him, contracting around buried vessels in slow pulses. "He's viable," Pell said, already reaching for his surgical kit. The first disconnection took 11 minutes. Pell worked with the scanner in one hand, a ceramic blade in the other, cutting nerve strap connections where they entered the compound above the soldier's hips. He severed each filament individually while monitoring spinal activity for cascade failures. The compound resisted. It gripped the filaments the way living tissue grips a splinter. Each cut sent a tremor through the surrounding surface. I watched the floor beneath my feet shift, the burial layer registering damage, deciding whether to manufacture a response. The soldier's eyes opened around the 5th minute. They tracked Pell's hands. His mouth moved, muscles working through shapes that might have been words in a language he'd been speaking when the world ended. His fingers twitched against the compound. Then his right hand closed into a fist. The first voluntary movement his body had performed since the sealing. Pell freed his upper body. The soldier separated from the compound with a wet, grinding sound, falling forward into Pell's arms. He breathed in rapid, shallow bursts. The compound still encased him from mid-thigh down. His open eyes remained unfocused while his hands repeated the same defensive gesture. Arms raised, palms out, shielding his face from something that had arrived decades ago. "Stay with me," Pell said. He put the soldier's hand against his own chest, giving him the rhythm of another person's breathing. The soldier's fingers closed on the fabric of Pell's vest. He held on. Pell cut into the compound around the right thigh. The scanner showed the first deep filament, branching around the femoral vessels and lumbar nerves. The layer had gone beyond reading the body. It had replaced functions the body no longer performed. "Volume expander," Pell said. I handed him the pack. He connected it, then cut the filament. The soldier's leg convulsed. His pulse fell from 48 to 19. Pell injected a vasopressor and ordered me to hold the severed filament against the wound. It moved under my glove, trying to return to its channel. My damaged hand could not judge the pressure. I watched the scanner until the pulse stabilized. The soldier kept hold of Pell's vest. His mouth shaped the same sound twice. Pell scanned the other leg. More branching filaments, pelvic circulation and autonomic signals routed through the layer. 20 minutes, both transfusion packs, the second expander and the ventilator, Pell said. I can separate him. I can't tell you what survives it. Leave him, Rhodes said. He's conscious. He's also decades behind a war that ended with his planet getting sealed in concrete. We are not equipped to rehabilitate him." Rhodes looked at me. "There are sealed orders, Hewitt. The root cylinder is classified Priority 1 strategic asset. Recovery takes precedence over personnel extraction, over the return gate itself if necessary." He paused to let that register. "Gate Command considers this cylinder the key to stable routes across hundreds of parallel worlds. Colonies are collapsing on worlds we can't reach because the network is degrading. The cylinder's value exceeds our lives, all of our lives. Those were my orders before we stepped through." The logic he was using, sacrifice the smaller group to preserve the larger mission, was the logic I'd built my career around. The same reasoning that justified cutting a gate on 6 soldiers to save a colony. I couldn't argue against it without arguing against the decision that defined me. Rhodes knew. I could see it in how he held my gaze. He'd chosen this moment to reveal the orders because he understood exactly which principle they invoked. The floor shifted again. A seam darkened outside the aid station door. Our powered anchor sat 30 meters away, broadcasting into a network Pell had cut open twice. "The man stays," Rhodes said. "We move." Pell clamped the severed filament, secured the fluid line, and eased the soldier against the wall. The man would not release his vest. Pell had to open the fingers one at a time. He left the canteen, the thermal blanket, the half-empty volume expander, and the scanner set to sound if the pulse stopped. A medic's arrangement of supplies that proved exactly how much was being abandoned. We moved on. The route descended into the coolant transfer station beneath the coastal marsh. The tunnels were industrial, wide enough for the hauler, lined with corroded pipe systems. Water covered the floor, ankle depth at first, rising to waist depth within the first 100 meters. The compound's presence weakened here. It coated the upper walls in thin, irregular patches, unable to maintain cohesion through saturated ground. Binders couldn't coordinate across the water. That much was good. The water itself was bad. Dissolved compound material saturated the flooded sections, interfacing with our equipment on contact. I noticed it first in the hauler's diagnostic display. The screen began answering queries nobody had sent, responding to network handshakes, trying to authenticate itself against a planetary registry. The compound in the water was treating the hauler as peripheral hardware, running integration protocols the same way it had absorbed our transit ring. The hauler died halfway through the station. Its drive motor locked. The treads froze. The diagnostic display filled with the same authentication sequence the binder had forced through the power coupling. Local route registration, operator identity, anchor authority. I killed the power before the integration reached the anchor cradle. The phase anchor itself was shielded, military-grade isolation around its core systems, but the hauler's frame had become a conduction path. Another minute would have brought the network through the vehicle's own wiring into the anchor. We pulled the anchor free by hand. Pell took one side of the cradle, I took the other. Nate carried our remaining power cells. Rhodes covered the waterline, weapon trained on patches of compound clinging to the tunnel walls. My arm was worse. The pylon's field strength increased with every step, the phase damage spreading from shoulder to elbow to wrist. I could barely feel the anchor handles. I carried the weight by watching my hands grip the metal, trusting my eyes where my nerves had quit. We reached the pylon's lower access in chest-deep water. The structure's foundation descended through the tunnel ceiling, a column of dark material 2 meters across, different from the burial compound, laced with internal channels visible through its partially transparent surface. Lines of slow light moved downward through those channels, sensory input being fed to the preserved population below. Nate pressed his graft against the column. A section of the surface separated, revealing a vertical shaft with ladder rungs built from repurposed human infrastructure. Subway handrails welded into climbing holds. Hospital bed frames bolted flat as platforms. The builders had used the sealed civilization as raw material for their own systems. We climbed. The pylon's interior was built from the world it had consumed. Subway platforms served as walkways between control sectors. Hospital corridors connected nodes of dark alien material that cycled with slow internal light. Residential walls formed boundaries between processing chambers. The builders had incorporated human infrastructure, treating the conquered world as useful raw material rather than wreckage to clear. The preserved population was everywhere. Bodies fixed inside the walls, the floors, the ceiling in some sections. Thousands of human figures held in the compound, their forms visible through the pale material the way shapes are visible through thin ice. Eyes moved behind sealed lids. Mouths worked through micro-expressions so slow that a single change took minutes to complete. These people were receiving controlled sensory input from the pylon's systems. Their nervous systems processed that input, generating the probability models the gate network used to navigate between parallel worlds. Beyond the thousands around us, I could feel the wider network through my damaged arm, a low-grade electrical presence filling the compound. Millions of minds worked at reduced biological rates. The computational output of an entire civilization's preserved consciousness, running navigation calculations in a system that had never asked permission to use them. Nate moved through the pylon with the confidence of someone who'd mapped this space in his head for years. His graft interfaced with access panels every 40 meters, brief contacts that opened sealed doors, redirected internal security, created temporary gaps in the compound's monitoring. Each use cost him. His hand responded more slowly afterward, his grip adopting patterns from the network, a wrist angle, a finger sequence borrowed from someone incorporated decades ago. We descended through 4 levels of converted infrastructure before Nate stopped. The control sector occupied what had once been a hospital emergency department. The treatment bays had been filled with compound, each containing a human figure wired into the pylon's junction architecture. Nerve strap filaments ran from each figure's spinal column into the dark material of the pylon's core. Biological cable connecting preserved minds to the navigation network. Nate's brother was in the 3rd bay. The boy, he would have been in his late 20s now, but the compound preserved the body at the age of capture, was sheathed from collarbone to feet. His face was partially exposed. His eyes were open. They tracked Nate's movement as he approached. His mouth shaped something, a word. Recognition moving across his features at a fraction of normal speed, the way weather moves across a landscape seen from orbit. Nate put his grafted palm against the compound next to his brother's face. The graft lit. His brother's eyes shifted toward it. Something passed between them through the network. I could feel it through my damaged arm as a spike of directed neural traffic, one consciousness reaching for another through the medium that held them both. Nate's hand moved. The movement was deliberate, unlike the loose borrowed gestures the graft had fed him in the tunnels. His index and middle fingers folded against his palm. His thumb locked across them, while his wrist turned outward and held. Route runners use that, when a passage has to be sealed behind them, Nate said. No retrieval. No one comes back through. His brother's eyes remained fixed on the hand. A second pulse crossed the graft. Nate's arm jerked toward a narrow black seam beside the bay, and his fingertips struck it 3 times in an uneven interval. The seam opened for less than a second. Behind it, channels of dark material converged on the structural junctions above the control sector. Then the surface closed, and Nate's hand fell away. He looked at the place his fingers had touched until he could reproduce the interval with his other hand. Can you get him out? He asked. I studied the connections. Nerve strap filaments ran from the boy's spinal column into 6 separate junction points in the pylon's core architecture. Each junction served dozens of other preserved figures. Disconnecting him would collapse navigation traffic through every person wired into the same array. Removing him kills everyone connected to this sector, I said. Nate met the answer with the dull certainty of a suspicion confirmed. Something he'd spent years preparing for. How many? I counted junction lines. Hundreds, maybe more. He put his palm against the compound once more. His brother forced the closure sign through the graft again. This time, Nate did not resist the movement. After a moment, he stepped back. "Show me the root cylinder," he said. The cylinder housing stood 6 meters down the hospital corridor, inside what had once been the emergency department's power distribution room. I found it mounted inside a column of dark material, connected to the pylon's primary systems by a web of nerve strap filaments so dense the connections looked like root structure. My damaged arm told me before anything else. The cylinder was active, drawing power, running a process that generated a field strong enough to collapse my spatial sense entirely. I had to hold the wall with both hands, watching my fingers grip the surface because I couldn't feel them. I knew what an active root cylinder looked like. I'd worked with them at Gate Command. A dormant cylinder stores coordinates, a library of gate connections, static data, waiting to be accessed. An active cylinder processes connections in real time. It builds routes. It navigates. This cylinder was navigating right now, running a targeting procedure through the nerve strap network, using the preserved population's neural output as computational power. I could feel our carrier signal. Our signal, the one I'd been fighting to preserve, being processed through the cylinder's systems. The pylon was using our gate connection as a targeting beacon, following our carrier signal back to its source, to our Earth. I pulled the diagnostic feed from the anchor. The data confirmed what my arm already knew. The cylinder had identified our home coordinates, classified our world as a viable replacement for the degrading navigation substrate. A living Earth with billions of active minds, capable of taking over the function the preserved population here was failing to maintain. The root cylinder was the component that would complete a targeting handshake between this world's failing system and our living one. Installing it in the anchor or opening a full return passage through it would finalize the transfer. Any physical crossing would do the same. Transit stations, military gateheads, population centers on our Earth would begin producing burial compound from local materials. The sealing would start before anyone understood what was happening. The binders had been trying to register the anchor under local control. The coupling attack, the authentication requests in the flooded hauler, and the filaments turning from hardware to skin only after Pell broke their connection all served that purpose. Our carrier signal had to remain intact. A live operator's nervous system had to supply the authority the anchor's military shielding refused to provide. The system also had to keep us from reaching the cylinder as free agents while preserving the door and someone it could use to open it. Getting home was the weapon. Our rescue was the planet's reload. I told them in the corridor outside the control sector. Rhodes, Pell, Nate, standing in the remains of a hospital hallway with preserved figures filling every wall. Rhodes processed it for 10 seconds. The root data is still inside the cylinder. The root data is part of the targeting procedure. It can't be separated. Gate Command has countermeasures for... There are no countermeasures for this. The transfer activates when the cylinder opens a passage stable enough for transit. The moment the system recognizes a full return route, the handshake completes. Our Earth gets flagged as replacement substrate. The compound starts generating from local materials. By the time Gate Command identifies the process, the first population centers are sealed. Rhodes's face didn't change. Millions of people are starving on worlds we could reach through that root data. The transfer risk is theoretical. The routes are confirmed. I have orders. Those orders account for hard choices. Your orders didn't account for this one. Nate cut through both of us. I don't care about your colonies or your orders. I want the pylon destroyed. Destroying it kills every preserved person connected to this sector, I said, including your brother. Nate's grafted hand moved at his side, then closed into the root runner sign his brother had forced through it. He showed me the sector closure. For 14 years, this system has processed navigation traffic through his nervous system every second. Nate looked at the walls around us, at the faces, the moving eyes, the mouths shaping words nobody would hear. I won't claim to know what all of them would choose. I know what he chose. I had a third option. The anchor could draw navigation capacity from the preserved population, route power through their neural activity to hold a temporary passage open. The passage wouldn't support physical transit or become a full return route. Too narrow, too unstable. But it could carry a data transmission. I could send everything, the targeting coordinates, the transfer protocol, the complete technical picture of what the pylon was doing, how the compound generated, how to detect it. Everything Gate Command needed to recognize the threat. It would kill the preserved humans whose neural activity powered the passage, hundreds, maybe more. People who were still conscious in some reduced way, still receiving input, still processing. The smaller group sacrificed so the larger group receives a warning. I'd been performing this calculation my entire career. 6 soldiers for a colony, 1 scout for an anchor. The people being sacrificed were always on the other side of the door. How long would the passage hold? Pell asked. A few minutes, maybe less. The people powering it, it will kill them. Pell looked at the walls, at the preserved figures, at their eyes. They're already gone, he said. The words carried a medic's verdict, informed by the soldier in the aid station, conscious enough to hold Pell's vest, dependent on the compound for circulation, breathing only because Pell had spent supplies we no longer carried. Pell had seen what separation required, and what the system had left of a body after decades inside it. His assessment came from that. The binders reached the core before we could act. The cylinder housing occupied the left wall between us and the control sector. Nate's brother remained in the third bay beyond it. I put the phase anchor against the opposite junction wall where the nerve straps converged. Pell took the corridor behind us. Rhodes stood between the anchor and the cylinder, close enough to reach either. The compound shifted. Seams opened in the walls, in the floor, in the gap between wall and ceiling. 6 creatures manufacturing simultaneously, the densest response we'd seen. The first 2 used the corridor's narrow dimensions to channel our fire into predictable lanes. They knew how soldiers fought in hallways. Danny's training, or some other soldiers from some other expedition. The knowledge was indistinguishable now. Rhodes dropped the first creature with 3 rounds through its forward plate junction. The second came out of the floor under Pell's firing position, restraint frame opening around his lower leg. Pell jammed the breaching bar across the frame before it closed and fired downward into the joint while the metal bowed against his boot. His last round cracked the joint. Pell levered the frame wide, twisted his boot free, and kept the bar. Nate drove his palm graft into the corridor wall. The graft lit. The compound around a third binder seized, its manufacturing process interrupted mid-assembly. The thing collapsed, plates separating, muscle losing cohesion. Nate's hand came away locked into a spasm that belonged to someone else. The remaining seams widened. I could feel production commands moving through the surface beneath my boots, each pulse striking the damaged nerves in my arm before the creatures took shape. "Whatever we're doing," I said, "we do it now." I opened the anchor housing and pulled the carrier limiter. Full output shook the frame against the wall. The activation switch was a recessed metal bar designed to require continuous pressure. I set my left hand on it, because that arm could no longer tell me how much it hurt. Watching my fingers close was the only way to know they remained there. Then I routed navigation capacity from the preserved population through the transmission array. The effect was immediate. The preserved figures nearest the anchor, maybe 20 visible through the compound, went rigid. Their eyes opened wide. Full dilation. Their mouths opened. Hands pressed against the inside of the compound in sudden violent bursts. Fingers splaying, palms flat, as if trying to push through the material that held them. The slow-motion existence they'd endured for decades collapsed into a few seconds of total awareness. They were being consumed. The anchor was burning their neural activity to fuel the passage, drawing decades of accumulated processing out through the nerve strap connections in milliseconds. Each preserved mind contributed a fraction of a second of transmission time. The passage opened, a thread of connection back to our gate coordinates, too narrow for a body, too narrow for anything except data. I fed the transmission through the anchor's systems, targeting coordinates, transfer protocol, the pylon's architecture, the compound's generation sequence, everything I'd learned since stepping through the gate, everything Gate Command needed to understand what was coming. The figures in the walls around the anchor went dark. Their eyes closed, their hands relaxed against the compound's interior surface. The passage consumed them, erased the neural activity that had sustained them, left the bodies intact but empty. The transmission ate outward from the anchor in a spreading circle. The circle widened. 40 people. 60. Over 100. Rhodes came at me. He left his rifle hanging. A round through the anchor would destroy his only way home with the cylinder. He kicked the lower housing instead. I turned between his boot and the frame. The anchor edge drove into my ribs. The activation bar shifted. I looked down to make sure my left hand still held it. 2 fingers remained hooked over the metal. The transmission stuttered, leaving 3 figures in the wall rigid between awareness and the dark. Rhodes struck under my ribs and seized the main cable. I caught his wrist with my right hand and drove my forehead into his jaw. The cable slipped in its clamp. Sparks crossed the floor. Behind us, Pell fired into a binder reaching past him for the anchor controls. 2 soldiers fighting over equipment in a corridor full of the dying. Neither of us speaking. The argument had already happened. This was what remained when the words ran out. Rhodes trapped my damaged wrist against the housing and turned it. There was no warning pain. I saw my elbow rotate and released before the bones did. My hand came off the bar. The carrier tone fell. I drove him against the cylinder housing and reached back for the switch. My left hand missed the anchor and closed on empty air. I looked, found the metal, and placed the fingers again one at a time. The carrier rose. Rhodes threw me down and reached for the cable clamp. Nate moved past us. His brother tracked him from the 3rd bay. Nate struck the narrow seam with the uneven interval the boy had shown him. The graft lit, and the wall accepted his hand to the wrist. Compound withdrew from the structural junctions above the control sector. Dark channels reversed. The old ceiling supports softened. The pylon tried to take the command back, cycling Nate's fingers through borrowed movements, while the seam held the graft in his palm. Blood ran into the wall. A binder turned from Pell toward Nate. Pell caught its rear plate with the breaching bar, tore the segment open with its own forward motion, and fired into the gap until it released him. Rhodes pulled the cable halfway out. The passage flickered. One line of bodies went dark while the next remained moving. I hooked my right arm around his neck and dragged him back. He crushed me against the housing. The carrier held. Nate met his brother's eyes and held the connection open. The control sector began to unbuild itself. Nerve junctions withdrew from the ceiling. Compounds separated along the hospital's old expansion joints. Filaments tore loose and whipped across the corridor, one striking the anchor hard enough to break the carrier into pulses. Rhodes heard the structure failing. He looked at the anchor, then chose the cylinder. His elbow struck the side of my head. He threw me against the wall and reached the housing. The first mounting bolt turned. The second started to move as the dark column twisted away from its supports. The ceiling failed in sections. The first slab tore Nate's hand from the junction and loosened the compound around his brother's bay. Nate went through the dust toward him. The second slab struck the cylinder housing. The cylinder cracked. A clean, high sound, ceramic under stress. Rhodes raised his right arm. Compound and concrete caught the forearm against the housing. The limb bent once under the weight and again when the mounting frame dropped. The cylinder fell in 2 pieces, its internal channels exposed and dark. The electromagnetic release struck my damaged arm like current through bare wire. My hand seemed buried in the wall, folded behind my back, still on the anchor switch. I looked down. The fingers were there. The carrier light died beneath them. The preserved figures in the walls went still. Around the anchor, the bodies that had powered the transmission lay dark inside unchanged compound. Their eyes no longer tracked movement. Faces and mouths held still. The passage had consumed them. Hundreds had gone empty in minutes, perhaps more. The transmission might have failed before reaching Gate Command. Even if it arrived, Gate Command might fail to decode the data or act in time. I had burned hundreds of preserved lives on a possibility. Nate's brother died when the control sector's power failed. The junction filaments connecting the boy's spinal column to the pylon's systems went dark in sequence, a cascade that ran through every preserved figure in the sector. The compound around his face lost its grip. For the first time in 14 years, the boy's features relaxed. His eyes closed and his body slid from the wall. Nate caught him. He held his brother in the wreckage of a hospital emergency department on a world that had been converted into a navigation instrument. He adjusted the boy's head against his shoulder, then stood motionless with the weight. "We need to move," Pell said. He was at Rhodes's side, assessing the pinned arm. "Captain's conscious. Arms broken in at least 2 places. We need to clear him before the rest of this structure follows." We pulled Rhodes free. He was grey-faced, his right arm hanging at an angle that told me Pell's estimate was generous. The cylinder fragments lay on the floor beside him. His mission objective, his sealed orders, his strategic justification, in pieces on a hospital floor. Nate laid his brother's body in the control sector bay. He pulled the graft from his right palm, gripped the dark disc with his teeth, tore it free, dropped it on the compound floor. The motor patterns it had been feeding him stopped. His hand was his own again. Damaged, bleeding at the graft site, but his. We took the dead anchor with us and descended through the flooded tunnels, through the launch corridor, back through routes already sealing behind us as the pylon's collapse triggered compound redistribution. The aid station breach had closed. Fresh compound filled the opening Pell had cut, smooth except for the shape of 2 raised hands beneath its surface. His scanner lay where he'd left it, half absorbed, its alarm silent. Pell put the sensor against the wall. The readout showed a flat cardiac trace. The volume expander, canteen and thermal blanket were visible deeper inside, arranged around a body the system had taken back without restoring what Pell had cut away. Pell switched off the scanner and left it there. Binders still emerged from seams, but their movements were simpler. Basic custodial responses without the tactical sophistication the pylon's coordination had supplied. We killed 2 and avoided the rest. The creature's inherited expertise seemed to have gone dark with the control sector. The unregistered were waiting at the tunnel perimeter. Grace Archer stood at the entrance with 4 armed route runners. She looked at what remained of us, 3 soldiers, 2 injured, on foot after the root cylinder's destruction. The phase anchor was dead, its power cells exhausted in the transmission. The carrier signal was gone. Our home coordinates were gone. The transit ring, 40 miles north, had been sinking into the compound for hours. "It didn't work," she said, as if confirming the answer she'd expected since we arrived. "The pylon's control sector is down," Nate said. "The targeting procedure is interrupted. Your safe routes should hold." "The west drainage?" Grace asked. "Open when we crossed it. The cistern line is still running." "And after that?" "Nothing short of a new gate event reactivates that sector." Nate held up his bare right palm, raw, bleeding where the graft had been. I pulled the access key. Grace looked at Rhodes, slumped between Pell and me. At the dead phase anchor we'd carried back through the tunnels for no reason except that we hadn't known what else to do with our hands. "Come inside," she said. The tunnels closed behind us. Rubber sheeting, oil lamps, stripped concrete. A world built to be invisible to the ground above it. Pell set Rhodes's arm in a supply room the unregistered used for equipment storage. The captain didn't speak. He sat against the wall while Pell worked, staring at nothing, running calculations on a mission that no longer existed. Nate found me in the corridor outside. His bare hand rested on his knee, the graft site wrapped in a strip of insulating rubber. He sat across from me against the stripped concrete wall. "You've done this before," he said. "Left people on the other side." "More than once." "How do you know if it was worth it?" "You don't." He considered that. Then he stood, walked towards the settlement's interior, and didn't come back. I sat with my ruined arm against the concrete. Above me, the burial compound covered everything. Highways, suburbs, launch complexes, the preserved remains of a civilization converted into a navigational instrument. Somewhere beneath that surface, the figures I'd consumed to power the transmission were dark inside their compound shells. Somewhere above it, a transit ring that connected to nothing sat in the pale material, sinking. On the other side, if the passage had held long enough, if the data had arrived intact, if the right person was watching the right terminal, Gate Command might already be reading a warning from a world their own records listed as extinct. I had no way to know whether the warning arrived or saved anything.